I remember the day so clearly. I was cleaning the inside of my husband's car when my hand slipped under the driver's seat and touched something small and smooth. I pulled it out and froze. It was a tube, not mine, not anything we had ever used together. In that moment, my heart pounded so loud I thought he would hear it. I didn't say a word. I just placed it back where I found it. And right then I knew my silence was going to speak louder than anything I could ever shout. Thank you for watching and giving me your time. It means more than I can ever put into words. Before I go deeper into my story, I would love to know where you are watching from. So please tell me in the comments, because I always enjoy seeing how far my voice travels. You see, when I held that tube in my hand under the seat, I felt something inside me break. But at the same time, something inside me woke up. I looked at it and I thought of the years I had given, the trust I had built, the love I had poured into a man who now carried secrets in the shadows of his own car. I placed it back and sat in silence with my chest tight. Not a word escaped my lips, because I knew that sometimes silence holds more power than any outburst ever could. I have lived many years with that man. Years that stretched from the first time he smiled at me, across a crowded room, to the nights we stayed up with our little one, trying to make ends meet, building what I thought was a foundation strong enough to last through storms. I gave up dreams of my own, so he could chase his. I cooked, I cleaned, I carried burdens quietly, because I believed that was what loyalty looked like. I trusted him in ways I never trusted anyone else. I thought I knew his every habit, every weakness, every tender part of his heart. We grew older together, our hair grayed, our skin lined, and I thought that meant we had weathered life hand in hand. I thought that meant we had reached a place of safety where betrayal could not touch us. But holding that small tube in my hand that day reminded me that even after decades, you can never fully know another's soul. It cut me deep, because all those memories of sacrifices, of raising our family, of sitting beside him when he had nothing, came rushing back to me. And for the first time I questioned if he had ever seen me, truly seen me, or if I had been nothing more than a convenience in his life. I thought of the long nights I stayed awake alone, waiting for him to come home, convincing myself that work had kept him late, telling myself he was tired, not uncaring. I thought of the birthdays he forgot, the anniversaries he brushed aside, the moments when I told myself he was just distracted by life. But maybe all along he had already chosen another path. The truth hit me like a wave. It was not just a tube under a seat. It was proof that the man I had built my world around had secrets he never meant to share. And as I sat with that knowledge pressing down on me, my silence grew heavier, because I realized the story of ours was not the one I thought I was living. And that is where my strength began to rise. Not from shouting or demanding answers, but from carrying the truth quietly and deciding that the day would come when my silence would tell him everything he needed to know. From that day forward, I began to see things I had ignored before. The small cracks in our life that I once smoothed over suddenly looked like gaping holes. I noticed how often he left the table with his phone pressed tight to his ear, speaking in whispers he thought I could not hear. I noticed the way he came home late and always smelled faintly of cologne he never used to wear, and how his shirts sometimes carried traces of perfume that did not belong to me. When I asked gentle questions, he brushed them away with excuses, saying he was tired, saying work was heavy, saying I worried too much, and for years I let those words wrap around me like a blanket to keep me from facing the truth. But after finding that tube under his seat, the blanket no longer warmed me. It burned. Every excuse sounded hollow. Every late night carved at me like a blade. I started watching him closely. The way he smiled at his phone. The way his eyes lit up not for me, but for whoever waited for him on the other side of his lies. And though my heart bled with every glance, I remained still, quiet, never letting him see my pain. I carried myself with calm, because I knew the moment I chose silence, I had already begun to write the ending of this chapter. But still, I could not help the memories that haunted me. I thought of the young girl I once was, standing in front of the mirror on our wedding day, believing she was walking into a forever built on honesty. I thought of the nights I stayed awake with fevers, with worries, and he promised me that he would never leave my side. And yet here I was, living under the same roof with a man who had already left me in every way that mattered. My hands shook sometimes when I held the kettle or folded laundry, because inside me anger boiled, sorrow churned, betrayal gnawed, but I told myself to wait, to hold steady, to let my silence gather weight, because one day it would fall on him heavier than any confrontation. He carried himself smugly, walking in and out as if his secrets would never surface, as if he had won some game I did not know I was playing, and that pride of his, that carelessness, only fed the fire in me. I sat with my thoughts like stones in my chest, and though they hurt, they also reminded me that I was stronger than the lies he thought he could bury. I was not the foolish woman he imagined. I was his mirror, holding his reflection in silence, waiting for the moment when his own betrayal would trap him. And on that day, he would understand that silence is never weakness. It is patience sharpened into a blade. The day I truly discovered the weight of what I had stumbled upon came when I returned to that car again. I remember the sunlight falling through the window as I wiped the dashboard, the quiet hum of the street outside. Everything felt so ordinary, until my eyes slid back to the place beneath the driver's seat. My hands trembled as I reached down, and there it was, that same tube, lying there like a snake coiled in the shadows. Only this time, I picked it up with purpose. I held it in my hand and stared at it for a long time, the small letters on the label spelling out a truth that screamed louder than anything he could ever confess. It was not for me. It had never been for me. And in that moment, something inside me turned cold. The love that had been burning in me for decades dimmed into ashes. I thought about every year I had cooked his meals, folded his clothes, sat at his side when life struck him down. And this was the thanks I received. A hidden tube waiting under a seat, like a cruel reminder that my loyalty had been met with betrayal. My heart thudded painfully in my chest. Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes. But I refused to let them fall, because I told myself I had cried enough for him over the years. This time, I would not give him the gift of seeing my sorrow. I would give him something else entirely. I slipped the cap open and looked at the contents. Then I placed it back carefully as though I were tucking away a secret, only it was no longer the same. I had changed what was inside, replaced it with something that would teach him the cost of every lie he thought he had buried. And when I closed that cap and slid it back under the seat, I felt a strange calm wash over me. Not joy, not victory, just calm, like the stillness before a storm. As I walked back into the house, I carried myself as though nothing had changed. I prepared his dinner, listened to his shallow words, nodded as he talked about his day. But inside me, I knew I had already sealed his fate. I was not going to shout, I was not going to accuse, I was not going to fight the way he expected. I was going to do something far sharper. I was going to let silence do the work for me. And the beauty of silence is that it cannot be undone. It cannot be argued with. It does not tire, it simply waits. And I waited, patiently, quietly, watching the days unfold until the night came when he would reach for that tube, thinking he was stepping into pleasure, unaware that he was stepping straight into a trap, built not with anger, but with quiet resolve. I held that secret in my chest like a stone, heavy but certain. And though it weighed on me, it also gave me strength, because for the first time in years, I was no longer powerless. I was no longer the woman overlooked and discarded. I was the woman who held the truth, and soon he would learn what it meant to underestimate silence. The days that followed felt like a long play where I was both the audience and the actor. I moved through my routines as though nothing had shifted. I set the table, swept the floors, washed the laundry, and carried the silence like a veil over my shoulders. He walked in and out of the house with that same smug smile, the same half-hearted greetings, his eyes glued more to his phone than to my face. And yet inside me I was no longer the same woman. I watched him carefully, every step he took, every word he said, every time he smoothed his hair before leaving, as though he were a man preparing for something more than work. I began to notice the little changes that before I would have brushed aside. The sudden energy in his step when evening came. The way he sprayed cologne not for me, but for someone else. The way he checked the mirror twice, as if approval mattered somewhere beyond our home. And all the while I said nothing. I did not confront him. I did not weep. I did not ask questions. Instead, I held my silence like a dagger hidden beneath my sleeve, sharp and waiting. Sometimes at night I would sit in bed, with the lamp casting a small glow, and I would study his face as he slept. I would wonder how many lies had passed his lips, how many moments he had stolen from me to give to another, and the thought would twist my stomach until I felt almost sick. But I would close my eyes and remind myself that the day was coming when his lies would fold in on him. I remember pouring his coffee in the morning and watching how he smiled to himself while stirring the cup, not at me, not at our life, but at the thought of his secret. And it hurt. It cut me in places deeper than any blade could reach. But even through the pain I found strength, because every secret has its reckoning. Every betrayal carries its price. And he would soon discover his. I did not need to chase him. I did not need to shout or beg or fight. I only needed to let the silence stretch long enough for him to walk into his own undoing. And with every passing day I felt the weight of the moment growing closer, like thunder building in the distance, steady and sure. And I knew when the storm came, it would not be me who drowned. It would be him. It was almost unbearable to watch how confident he had become in his lies, how comfortable he was living two lives under one roof. He carried himself like a man who thought he was untouchable, making jokes at my expense at the dinner table, rolling his eyes when I reminded him of something important, speaking with a tone that suggested I was nothing more than a shadow in the background of his grand stage. But what he could not see was that the shadow he mocked was the same one preparing to eclipse his light. I remember one evening especially. He came home dressed sharper than usual, his hair combed back neatly, his shoes polished as if he were going somewhere better than home. He walked past me, without so much as a glance, humming a tune under his breath, as though his secret joy was too big to contain. And I sat there quietly, folding a towel, watching him glide around the room with a pride that made my skin crawl. I wanted to scream, to shout, to demand the truth, but instead I smiled faintly, because deep inside I knew the arrogance that blinded him was the very thing that would drag him into ruin. I let him enjoy his performance. I let him act as if I was invisible, and all the while my silence grew heavier, thicker, until I could almost feel it pressing down on him, even if he did not know it yet. He looked in the mirror before leaving, straightened his tie, smirked as though the world was his to conquer. And in that moment I thought to myself that he was already conquered, not by me, not by another woman, but by the truth he could not escape. I poured myself a glass of water and sat in the quiet after he left. And I told myself to wait, because soon enough, the same pride that made him believe he could walk over me would be the pride that sent him into the arms of pain and humiliation. And I did not have to lift my voice to bring it about. All I had to do was let him reach for what he thought was pleasure, unaware that in his hands he would be holding the very key to his downfall. The night I had been waiting for came quietly, without any grand signal, without any warning, just like storms that roll in on the stillest evenings. He came home with that same spring in his step, his tie loosened, his voice humming low, as if a song was playing inside him that I was not meant to hear. He barely touched the dinner I had placed before him, pushing the plate aside with a careless hand, glancing at the clock as though time belonged to someone else, not to me. Not to us. And I watched him closely, my heart steady, my hands calm, because I knew what he did not. I knew where his evening would lead him, and I knew how it would end. He disappeared into the bedroom for a while, changing clothes, splashing on cologne, the same cologne that had begun to smell like a stranger in my own house. He walked past me with a half smile, tossing a remark about how he would be late. And for the first time in years, I looked at him and did not feel powerless. I felt certain my silence sat on my tongue like a secret too sharp to swallow, but I kept it. I let it rest there, because I had already spoken my truth in another way, not with words but with action. And there was nothing left to say. I heard the car start outside, the engine growling like it always did, and I imagined his hand reaching under that seat, pulling out the small tube he thought no one knew about. I could see it so clearly in my mind, the smug grin spreading across his face, the anticipation in his eyes, the thrill of betrayal he thought he had mastered. And I sat in the quiet house, the ticking of the clock louder than usual. Each second pushing him closer to the moment he would realize what I had done. I poured myself a cup of tea, my hands steady, my breath even, and I let the steam rise in front of me, as though it were the ghost of all my swallowed words, all the years I had given, all the pain I had buried, and I thought about how strange it felt that revenge could sit so quietly in the chest, not as fire, but as still water, calm on the surface but deep enough to drown a man. Hours later the phone rang, sharp and shrill, breaking through the silence. I picked it up slowly, and on the other end was chaos. Voices raised, panic spilling through the line. They told me he had been rushed to the hospital. An accident, something gone wrong. And though my hand tightened on the receiver, my voice remained steady. I said I would come. I said nothing more. I hung up the phone and sat for a moment in the dim light of the kitchen. And I thought of the choices that had led us here. His choices, my silence, the secret tucked under a seat, and how all of it had converged into this one night where the truth had finally caught him. I did not smile, I did not laugh. I simply breathed, because this was not joy, it was justice, it was the balance of betrayal being paid in full. And as I gathered my coat and stepped into the cool air of the night, I told self that he would now understand what he had never believed, that silence is never weakness. It is a storm waiting to fall. When I reached the hospital, the smell of antiseptic filled the air, sharp and cold, and the fluorescent lights hummed above me, as though they were whispering the secrets of the broken souls lying beneath them. I walked slowly down the corridor, each step echoing against the tiled floor, steady and deliberate, as if the silence I had carried all this time was now walking beside me. I found him in a room with pale walls and machines that beeped in steady rhythm. His face was pale, his body restless, and his eyes darted nervously when they saw me standing in the doorway. For the first time in years he looked small, stripped of the smugness that once carried him, stripped of the pride that had blinded him. He tried to speak, his lips parting to form excuses, but his voice faltered. Because what could he say? What words could undo the truth that had finally trapped him? I moved closer, my hands folded calmly in front of me, and I watched him squirm under the weight of my silence. It was heavier than chains. It was louder than any shout I could have ever thrown at him. He whispered fragments, saying he could explain, saying it was not what it looked like, his eyes wide, searching mine for softness, for mercy. But there was none left. Not after all the years I had carried his lies like stones on my back. I leaned closer, close enough for him to hear my breath, and I spoke only a single line, slow and steady, the words falling like stones into water. I told him I knew all along, and in that moment his face drained of what little color remained. His mouth opened as if to protest, but no sound came, because the silence between us spoke louder than any defense he could give. He turned his eyes away, staring at the ceiling, and I saw the weight of shame press down on him harder than the machines pressing against his skin, harder than the pain that had driven him here. I stood by his bedside for a long while, not as a wife offering comfort, but as the woman he had underestimated, the woman he had betrayed, the woman whose silence had written the ending he never saw coming. And though my heart should have been racing, it was calm, steady, almost still. Because I no longer needed answers. I no longer needed apologies. The truth was already laid bare in the wires that tethered him, in the hushed whispers of the nurses outside the door, in the way he could not bring himself to look at me. Everything I needed was already here, and I turned my silence into a shield, one that he would never be able to break again. I remember sitting in that chair by his bed, the hum of the machines filling the silence between us, and for the first time in a long time I felt no urge to fill it with words. I let the quiet stretch. I let it press against him until he shifted uncomfortably, his eyes flickering toward me, and then away, his mouth opening only to close again, because no excuse could soften what had already been revealed. The pride that once clung to him had crumbled, and all that remained was a man staring into the face of his own undoing. I thought back to every night I had swallowed my pain, every morning I had forced a smile, every moment I had chosen peace when I could have chosen confrontation, And I realized that those choices had led me here, to this exact moment, where I did not need anger, I did not need shouting, because justice had already spoken for me. It had spoken through the silence, through the trap he had walked into with his own hands. And now here he lay. Not because I fought him, but because I had let the truth reveal itself in its own time. As I watched him struggle to form words, I saw the shame painted across his face, the fear hidden in his eyes, and I thought about how betrayal always begins with arrogance. The belief that you will never be caught, that you are smarter than those who trust you. But arrogance always forgets one thing. It forgets that even the quietest eyes see more than they let on. I leaned back in the chair, my hands folded neatly in my lap, and I let him sit with his thoughts, let him stew in the silence that I had carried for so long, and for once it was not me who was restless. It was him. I had given him every chance to walk the straight path, every chance to hold to the vows he made so many years ago. But he had chosen another way, and now that way had led him here, stripped of dignity, stripped of pride, clinging to the edge of excuses that no longer mattered. I felt no pity for him, only a strange calm that came from knowing that justice, when it finally arrives, does not need to shout. It simply stands in the room, quiet and undeniable. And that night, as the machines beeped steady and cold, I knew that nothing between us would ever return to what it had been, because he had crossed a line that only silence could answer. And silence had already spoken. As I sat there in that cold room, I thought of the years I had poured into a man who now could not even lift his eyes to meet mine. I thought of the laughter we once shared, the plans we once made, the promises whispered late at night when life was young, and we still believed forever meant something unshakable. And yet here we were, forever broken, shattered by the choices he made in secret. I wanted to ask him why he thought the arms of another could ever give him more than the loyalty I had shown. Why he believed he could carry on his lies without consequence. But I kept my lips sealed, because the truth was already heavy in the air. And I did not need his confession to know what he had done. My silence was enough. It was the mirror he refused to look into, and that mirror showed him everything he wished to hide. I leaned back in the chair, my heart calm in a way that surprised even me. I expected rage, I expected tears, but what I felt was a strange strength, the kind that only comes when you finally realize you are no longer trapped by someone else's choices. I was free from the illusion I had carried for decades, free from the burden of pretending not to see, and that freedom gave me power, more power than any revenge could offer. He shifted again on the bed, muttering broken sentences, reaching for excuses, for sympathy, but I gave him none. I let him sit with the weight of his actions. I let him taste the loneliness that comes when you betray the only person who ever stood by your side. The silence between us grew thicker, almost unbearable, and for the first time it was not me who suffered in it. It was him. He had always mistaken my quiet for weakness, but now he saw it for what it truly was, the sharpest blade, the final word. And as the machines continued to beep their rhythm, I knew that lesson would follow him longer than any scar, because silence had become his punishment, and silence would never let him forget. As I watched him lying there, pale and restless, I felt the years of my own silence rising through me like a tide. I thought of the countless nights I had swallowed my questions, the mornings I had buried my suspicions, the afternoons I had stood by the window waiting for him to come home with excuses that fell from his lips smoother than any truth. And I realized that every one of those moments had prepared me for this. We're sitting here now, strong and steady, while he drowned in the shame of his own making. I remembered how many times I convinced myself that love meant patience, that loyalty meant endurance, that marriage meant forgiveness without end. But staring at him, I knew better. I knew that love without honesty rots, that loyalty without respect breaks you, that marriage without truth is nothing more than a cage. And in that hospital room, I felt those chains fall away from me at last. He turned to me again, his eyes wet with something that might have been regret, his lips forming the shape of my name as though calling it could bring back what he had lost. But I did not answer. I let him sit in the silence, because I knew words at that point were meaningless. No apology could mend what he had torn. No explanation could erase the years he had chosen deceit over devotion. And so, I gave him nothing. I let my stillness speak. I let my silence cut deeper than any words could. Because he had to feel it. He had to sit in the emptiness he had created. And as I sat there watching him twist under the weight of that truth, I found myself almost at peace. Not because he suffered, but because I had finally reclaimed myself, my strength, my voice even in silence. I was no longer the woman overlooked, no longer the woman deceived. I was the woman who had endured, and who had risen above the ashes of betrayal. And as the night deepened and the machines hummed on, I knew that no matter what became of him, he would never forget this. He would never escape the lesson that silence had taught, a lesson that would linger with him long after the hospital walls faded from memory. As I rose from that chair and looked down at him one last time, I felt a calmness settle over me that I had not known in years. It was the calm of a woman who had given her all, who had carried loyalty like a banner, only to be betrayed by the very man she had trusted most. Yet it was also the calm of knowing that I had not let bitterness consume me. I had let silence speak, and it had spoken louder than any scream ever could. I walked out of that room not as a broken wife, but as a woman who had faced betrayal and reclaimed her strength. I knew he would carry the weight of his choices for the rest of his days, and that was justice enough. Sometimes revenge is not in the noise. It is in the quiet dignity of walking away with your head held high. And that is exactly what I did. I carried my silence like a crown. Thank you for staying with me till the very end of my story. It means so much to me. Please tell me in the comments where you are watching from, because I love to know how far my voice travels. And do not forget to subscribe so you never miss the stories I still have to share with you.